Good morning, Joe KRAUS, because in France it's 5:30 p.m. In California right now it's 8:30 a.m. So thank you so much actually for this very early call. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm good, thank you. Like everybody else on this call, I'm currently at my house, and I apologize to everybody if you hear kids and other activity in the background, but that's how we're all operating now. So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, but just so you know what's back in my background.
That's actually pretty great. In this kind of moments, we have the family all around, and we get to meet our coworkers' families also through the internet usually. We'll have this 30 minutes conversation with you. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us and watching this. We're very excited to have you all together for our first remote mobility talk. Joe is the president of Lime. He has amazing things to share with us, and I think this talk is actually going to be very interesting. It's going to be a 30 minutes conversation with Joe. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat right on the side, and we'll try to pick as many as we can during the talk. The talk will be divided in 4 parts. Emeric?
Yeah, the first part will be about COVID-19, the second part about business, third part about investment, and last part about inspiration. And then, as Mobility Makers is really dedicated to bring all together, don't forget the business meeting that will happen after. So, Joe, let's start with this situation. What is your strategy in this lockdown time?
Yeah, so I guess I would just think about this in a few ways. First, it's just I would love to be engaged in a dialogue with everybody here. I'll just reiterate, thank you for coming. I think all of us that are in this gathering are really interested in micromobility, both personally and professionally, and to see kind of what's happening and have a discussion about what's happening in the uncertain times that we have. That's what I'm most interested in. So my prepared remarks are actually going to be quite short. In a desire to really be into a dialogue from many of the folks that I've at least seen in the chat so far. So I think everybody's lives personally, whether you have friends or family that are affected or sick, or it's certainly changed everybody's personal lives. It's affected obviously all of our civic lives, the lack of an ability to gather and have our normal interaction in the cities we all call home. And it's certainly affected business lives all around the world, and Lime is no exception. And what I thought I would do is just share a little bit about how on this business side, how Lime's business has been affected. You know, we operate in 24 countries around the world. And I think the first thing that's been amazing is how quickly the situation went from a gradient of markets being affected by coronavirus, where what we were seeing initially was countries that were in a severe condition, having a certain profile, moderate, and modest were really the 3 striations we saw. And this is back at the beginning of March. And within a 7-day period, as the entire world went into lockdown, everybody went into a condition that we were classifying as severe, as it related to both kind of what the quarantine situations were in their countries, as well as what the impact on micromobility was, which is essentially the draining of all demand down to incredibly low levels, which were appropriate, given what the civic orders were in terms of sheltering in place. And so the effect on Lime has been for the last, I'm going to approximate here, at least the last 10 days, perhaps even 12 days, we've been completely shut down as a business. We've just paused all of our markets, and certainly Paris first among them. We're complying with the orders from local authorities and trying to do our part, as is everybody here, on flattening the curve for reducing pressure on healthcare systems. The only market that we're operational in is Korea, which seems to be handling its virus very differently and has thus far managed to contain it into mostly a single city. So during this time, we're trying to do our part. We've recalled all of our fleets and stored them and secured them, because our intention is, when local authorities say that it's safe to operate again, we intend to be doing so. In the meantime, our view is that, one, we have a large audience, and the second is we see a large need continuing. And so one of the things that we've started doing is, in many places around the world, found philanthropic and charitable organizations to become involved with. And one of the sad things that we've seen, particularly in many countries, and unfortunately France is no exception, is the increase in domestic violence as people are stuck together and don't have places to escape. And we've seen an increase of almost 40% in domestic violence. And so we've partnered with the Fondation des Femmes to promote and donate to the organization, encourage our riders at this time to try to be doing something to contribute. And so we are going to be asking our riders in Paris to be contributing to that organization. I have, and I hope that our riders do as well. So we're trying to be active in these times, even if it's not on the micromobility front. It's to be a good corporate citizen and a good steward in the cities in which we operate. Our one possible thing that we think, everybody's trying to forecast what are the consequences of this pandemic. How will life be different when we reemerge from it? Because I think there's confidence that we're going to reemerge. There's no confidence on what that timeline looks like, and there's lots of guesses as to what's going to happen and how things are going to be different. And one of the things, our theme, broadly speaking, at Lime is to promote this idea of a people-first city. What is a city but for its people? And I think one of the things that you see again and again is pictures now of cities that have an entirely different profile. And so this is in many ways a completely unintended consequence of all the vehicular traffic coming out of cities, but you have a cityscape now that's, one, empty, both of people and of cars. But I think there's an interesting component here, which is that how are people going to react over time, having seen now cities which look entirely different than they did when they were operating in highly congested, highly polluted levels. I think the other thing that I suspect, because we saw it at the very tail end, right before quarantines went into effect, is that as you saw people moving to work in those times pre-quarantine, you started to see a preference of bikes and scooters over buses and subways. And that was just a reaction around people not wanting to gather with other humans too close together. And one of the speculations we have is that when we start to come out of this, how will people's behavior change? Unfortunately, probably at the beginning because of fear. But nonetheless, will that cause some modal shift toward the preference of bikes, towards a preference towards scooters, at least initially? And that as people get accommodated to new forms of micromobility, does that portend a more subtle but longer lasting shift towards micromobility?
Joe, about the COVID situation. So Lime doesn't have any cities open.
Only in Korea.
Only in Korea. And what do you think about other operators that are still operating?
I think that the most important thing we can do as operators is to be responsible and to do our part in terms of public health. That's the highest order priority, is public health. And so my view is that all operators should obey the callings of public health authorities. And within that, they can make their own decisions. So I believe, but I'm not certain, because I'm first and foremost focused on what Lime is doing around the world. But I think as long as other operators are operating within the recommendations of public health authorities, then I think it's to their own discretion about whether it makes sense to operate. I see there's a question in here around batteries. So we've looked at all of our standard operating procedures. As I think everybody here knows, we build our own and design our own vehicles. We've consulted with all of our engineers on battery chemistry and ensured that, yes, we have for our standard operating procedures, when we pull them back, we're not going to have any issues with revivals, even if this lasts, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, however long it happens to last. We've looked at the numbers and are confident that we're not concerned about battery condition over time. Let me pivot a little bit to, while I've been an operator much of my career, I did a 10-year stint as an investor for Google Ventures, investing in startups around the world. And one of the things that I think is hard to see is, there's an adage in the investor community, which is, be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful. Greedy is not really a good word in this particular context, but be opportunistic when others are fearful might be the better word. And I actually think if you look back in history, if you look at the dot-com crash of 2000 and 2001, if you look at the financial crisis of 2008, some amazing companies were started in those times. And so one of the things as an investor that I think about is how resilience is built in these hard times. And I think about this in two ways. One is, I think that you're going to see some amazing companies started in this time of hardship, because one of the biggest determining factors in whether a company is successful is this combination of determination and persistence. And it takes a tremendous amount of determination and persistence to start a company in a crisis. The second thing is that I firmly believe that the landscape of micromobility will be different at the end of this crisis. I do love the Darwin quote, which is that it's not intelligence and strength that conveys survival. It is adaptability. And as I think about this crisis, one of the things that I think it continues to emphasize for cities is that the most important factor to select and think about with micromobility partners is reliability, is dependability. And I think that that desire is going to be even stronger when we come through the end of this crisis. So I'm just going to, let me pause and kind of stop prepared remarks here and turn it over to Q&A, and I'm looking forward to dialogue and happy to answer any questions or.
I already see a very interesting question from Dries, who is a general manager for Friends of Bird. Right before jumping to his question, actually, with Bird announced a few days ago now that they would have to lay off 30% of their employees. What's Lime's position also concerning you have 600 full-time people working at Lime. You also have 4,000 to 5,000 independent contractors. What's your position about them now? And right after that, of course, we'll take Dries Ibn Mansour question.
Great. So I'll start with, I think very few companies globally are immune to the negative impact of COVID on their business. Whether you are in the hotel business, whether you are Airbnb, if you're in travel, if you are in hospitality, if you're in the food service business with a small business running a restaurant, if you're in the micromobility business, anything that requires humans to go about their normal life, either being interested in traveling and exploring, being interested in working, being in a group, your business is negatively affected. And it's like, if you just look in the United States, 1 week ago, the unemployment claims came through, and in the United States, they increased to 3 million people applying for unemployment in a single week, which is insane that essentially 1% of the country in a week filed for unemployment. So the impact is broad and the impact is deep. And I was sad to see the human impact that Bird had to go through. And I think, Lime back in early January had actually done a reduction in force of 14% of our workforce.
Okay.
And I think that one of the reasons that we did that is we wanted to be highly prepared for setting the business up for long-term success.
All right.
So,
we had the
last piece I would say is that because we have a meaningful footprint in Europe, I think Europe has done a really good job in both France and Germany, having programs that allow for the state to be a partner in supporting employees as we go through this transition. And we're examining those programs specifically in those two countries in order to work with them to provide the most stable environment we can for our employees, especially in Europe.
All right. Well, that's great. Thanks for these answers. Well, we just also to give a little frame here about the business. I love the cup, by the way. The Star Wars cup is a hit. That's very cool. So Lime started its operations in 2017. Can you just remind to our audience how many rides in the world and how many cities you guys opened within 2.5 years, 3 years now?
Yeah, we announced maybe 4 or 5 months ago that we'd done over 100 million rides. We haven't disclosed anything above that publicly yet. 24 countries, upwards of 110 cities all over the world.
That's impressive. One thing that you said when we met at Station F a few months ago, it actually hit me a lot, is that out of all these cities, you have 50% of your implementation of the rides, that happen in Paris, not in France. Right? In Paris, you had 50% of these 100 million rides. That's correct, right?
I don't think it's not that concentrated. It's a high fraction. I don't know what it is, but it is not 50%.
Okay, that's what I had in mind.
I would like to say it is. It's not.
All right. No, because honestly, I was thinking maybe you guys should consider to have your HQ here in Paris. We would be more than happy to have you.
We're despite the fact that I'm an American, despite the fact that we're headquartered in San Francisco, we are in many ways a European company. The primary reason is that we run a very distributed organization where our regional general managers that are based in Europe are the CEOs of their markets. And we have a majority of our revenue actually coming from Europe. And we think Europe remains, for the reasons I think everybody on this call knows, the best market for micromobility because cities are older, more dense. Cars were always a very tough fit in those cities. European cities invested in both alternatives to cars with infrastructure like bike lanes, alternative vehicle formats like what Americans would call mopeds, and a public transit infrastructure that is far more dense and reliable, which creates demand for last mile mobility. So all in all, what that translates to is Europe is a better market for micromobility because the preconditions are better.
Joe, in 2008, what were you doing during the crisis? Is there any comparison with nowadays?
I mean, from an investment point of view, I do think I think a few things happen. One is I think you did see firms in 2008 that didn't adapt fast enough to the new reality, and they spent too much money and went out of business or required a merger or consolidation of some form. The second thing I thought that you saw was that some very enterprising entrepreneurs began new companies. And because the hiring landscape had changed, they were able to recruit some incredible talent that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to because there was a lot more competition for those same, let's say, world-class engineers. So in the technology business, what's really interesting is that I think you're going to see my view is that the chances of a great startup succeeding in a crisis is much higher than in a time of abundance. Let me put it this way. When capital is easy to get. When venture capital is easy to get, you get a lot of companies starting that essentially use that money to kill each other and everybody dies. But in an environment where it's hard to get, the best ideas are only the ones that get funded. And it's a very scarce environment for capital, which allows those companies to get runway, build out a market, and succeed. So I actually think, as a former person who was essentially someone who bet on these markets, now is actually a great time to start a company.
Okay, we understood that effectively a lot of VCs advise startup to reduce the expense, to watch out the cash burn and investment. What is your strategy at Lime?
So
how long do you think Lime keep running?
Yeah, I mean, our view is that we think it's a likely shutdown of between 8 and 16 weeks before there is any likely demand of any kind of scale in the markets. That's a guess, right? That is not a, we have no crystal ball, but I think looking at the available information, that's our guess. We think there's some probability that those companies that went in first come out first, just given the nature of what we see in terms of when rates of illness are accelerating versus flattening versus decelerating. And then obviously we're doing everything we can on the cost reduction side, because you don't want to be burning money unnecessarily. I think everybody, Lime included, is trying to husband and retain resources in order to come back stronger when demand resurges. I think the other interesting part is that people have really learned the lessons of 2008 for those of us who were operating in business at that time. I think when 2008 happened, first, this crisis economically is happening much faster. What took 6 weeks then is taking 6 days now in terms of both the economic impact and people's ability to recognize that the situation on the ground is really different. What I remember in 2008 is it took people a while to get their head around the idea of, well, what's going to happen and what'll capital availability were like. They believed that for them, it would be different than for others. But I think what's happening here is people are really reacting quickly and recognizing that, no, capital is going to be more scarce. The operating conditions are going to be uncertain. We need to prepare for the worst in order to be ready for the best. So I think that's the other difference that I see in comparison is the speed with which the impact is happening, the speed with which people are reacting is completely compressed, probably 10 to 1 from that time.
Okay. Okay, we saw that VIA just raised 200 million. So it means it's possible to keep raising money during this lockdown time. Thanks for your advice and for the startup. Now, just a little yes/no question. Would you invest in the autonomous vehicles?
Would I invest in autonomous vehicles?
The game, invest or not invest?
Yes or no?
I don't think I would put money into a complete autonomous vehicle company simply because the amount of capital required to get it done is measured in billions and billions of dollars. I think there might be a couple of critical components, but I strongly suspect that the time for venture capital investing into autonomous vehicles was 5 to 10 years ago. Or the only other company I'd probably invest in is from my former employer, which is Waymo, because I think they're by far the furthest ahead.
Oil and gas?
I mean, come on, as somebody operating in the micromobility space, I can't invest in oil and gas. Plus, with oil below 20 or at $20 a barrel, I think that there is going to be long-term change when you have these shocks to the system, and so I am not both at a personal level and a mission and purpose level. I'm not an oil and gas person. I don't believe that's the future I want. And then secondarily, I think that this global shock to demand. I'm not an oil specialist by any means, but I think that big changes do have reverberating consequences over time.
So I don't ask for automotive industry. That's what, last one. Hardware or software?
I mean, having been involved in software and hardware businesses, software businesses are easier. Just fundamentally, they are easier. They're easier because of a very simple reason, which is you have no cost of goods in terms of making a business. That said, what ignites my passion is affecting people's daily lives. I didn't want to work on another social network or another piece of productivity software. What gets me up in the morning, what makes me excited, is the ability to affect people's daily lives. And truthfully, that means hardware in many cases. So what I love are these businesses that blend the physical world with the virtual, software plus hardware. And that's what gets me excited about Lime and micromobility in general, is you're affecting people's daily lives. It is a tangible product that you can put your hands on, and it involves this intersection of software coordinating the action of a huge amount of hardware.
It's very interesting. We'll have some questions from the chat, and then we'll jump into the section inspiration. If you can still stay with us a few more minutes, because we're really enjoying this chat. I hope you are still able to stay a bit with us. We have Stéphane Eboko actually from the Total Group, who is asking about the relationship between micro-mobility providers and energy providers. I think he's talking about electricity for the charging and rebalancing costs.
I mean, what's interesting is that I think you see again, I'm by no means an expert here, but the thing that I am encouraged by is that unlike, if I look back in railroad companies which perceive themselves as being in the railroad business, not the transportation business, I think all of the energy companies perceive themselves, broadly speaking, as energy providers, not necessarily wedded only to oil and gas and carbon intensive sources of electricity. That is the classical example of Darwin in action in terms of adaptability to major large-scale change. Managing that transition is difficult. Obviously, when you have a ton of fixed infrastructure that is about the production of your primary product, and navigating that change will be hard. But my general view is that I think that the vast majority of the energy providers in the world are slowly but surely going to make this shift to sustainable production, sustainable sources of energy, out of not necessarily simply that doesn't require an altruistic bent. That simply requires a orientation towards what is the future and how do you can actually do that in a profit maximizing way, I guess I would say. So this idea that like the energy companies find it in their own self-interest, I would believe, to move towards those methods of producing electricity sustainably. And as they do so, I think every micromobility provider is trying to maximize their sustainability impact by electrifying by creating clean electricity for their entire operations and removing oil and gas from any of their operations, be it from their vans and electrifying that to renewable electricity for their charging infrastructure.
All right. Actually, it answers a few other questions about the environment and sustainable economy. So that's very good. We have a question from Bertrand Fleuros, who is the CEO and founder of CityScoot, the fleet sharing moped company in Paris, about rumors that we've all read about Lime raising money at a lower value. Do you want to comment on that?
My view is if you look at any company, public, private, even deals that were funded, this is resetting what industries are worth, broadly speaking. I think anybody who's in the micromobility industry who believes that their valuation is the same as it was pre this crisis is fooling themselves. My general view is that intermediate valuations, none of that actually matters. What matters is what impact you're having in the world over the fullness of time, because that's what ultimately creates value. I like the Warren Buffett quote, which is that in the short term, the markets are a voting machine, and in the long term, a weighing machine. So what does he mean by that? In the short term, the market is swayed by sentiment. It is swayed by fear. It is swayed by feelings of opportunity. It is wildly swinging between these poles of I'm afraid and I'm feeling very opportunistic. In the long term, what does the market do? It weighs impact through, in the market's case, profits, and in my case, both the economic profits that a business can generate and the societal impact that it can have. And so none of these things actually, in my opinion, they're interesting to talk about, but they don't matter. What matters is what's the long-term impact, what's the long-term profit-making ability. And again, I just repeat, everybody on this call, whether you're in the micromobility business or not, your business is not worth the same amount than it was a month and a half ago, flatly.
Wow. All right. Thank you very much. That's actually a very clear answer, and we really appreciate it. Just a few more seconds, maybe on inspiration. We wanted to have, at least if you can tell us one major decision that you took over your professional life that seemed maybe a little bit crazy or did not seem to make sense to other people around you, but finally, or was hard to take for you, and finally had a great outcome. Do you have anything like that in mind that you could share with us?
I guess I think of a couple. The first is when I was graduating university, everybody of responsibility in my life told me to go get a regular job. And I felt so much pressure that I actually did apply and received an offer and accepted an offer to kind of a normal corporation, but it wasn't what was in my heart. It's not what I wanted to do. In fact, I was scrounging together money from friends and family to start my first company, and ultimately decided to, sadly, it's not a proud moment of mine, but like 2 days before I was supposed to show up, I sent a letter saying that I wasn't coming, and ultimately started my first company back in the very early days of the internet in 1993. That company went public in 96, and ultimately I sold it in 2000. So it was probably the most consequential decision that I had made that set me off in terms of a career of entrepreneurship. But it was really disregarding the hard-won wisdom of my betters and elders. But I had to, I think what it was a combination of naivete, a combination of also recognizing that the world was changing in a meaningful way back then, because we were going from like no internet to internet, these big platform shifts. And part of me does wonder, is this crisis that we're facing, is there another style of like big shift that's happening that is hard to see right now, of kind of before COVID, after COVID? Because usually in those big shifts is where there is obviously a huge amount of chaos and disruption, but also there's a kernel of something new that's emerging, that's widespread in its impact. And those platform shift moments are the times when big things happen.
Okay, Joe, I don't know if you have more time, but if you want to pick up some question in the chat, or I don't know, because we are over 40 minutes.
Let me see if I can. I have till 9:15 my time, so I have another 5 minutes.
Great.
Sorry to everybody while I just turn my attention to the chat. And I don't want to do the unfair thing, which is start at the end. So like recent questions. So I'm going to scroll up to the top. Everybody does
from the top earlier, but
yeah, pick up some of the top.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Do you think the model of startup mobility as Lime, Uber, etc. is over?
I don't. And I want to acknowledge that one of the interesting things about mobility in general is it's incredibly resistant to change in some way. Like if you just really think about it, the way we've gotten around has been quite stable for decades. It is, so essentially, I like to say the hardest thing to change is a habit. And people's habits in mobility are, they're hard to change, just as all habits are. I feel very proud of what Lime's been able to achieve, both in terms of global scale and impact. And I also want to recognize that these changes take a long time to get people to make. So I actually continue to be very excited about startups in mobility. And I want to recognize that just as all startups are hard, startups in mobility are perhaps even harder, because they involve massive changes to people's habits and daily lives. And that takes, your product better be, the old saying is it's got to be 10x better than the alternative. Maybe it's even steeper in the mobility category, just because it involves, how people live their daily lives.
Okay, there is an interesting question because I think there are a lot of startups that are working in the MaaS platform. And is Denis Saad who say, do you consider integrating other mobility player in the Time app being integrated in MaaS platform?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you consider integrating other mobility players in the Lime application?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say about that right now. But
you're keeping the,
so yeah, I want to demur and just basically say I'm not ready to answer that question yet.
Okay, that sounds pretty good though.
I think there's a lot of belief, broadly speaking, that integration between services is only net beneficial to customers, be it into MaaS applications. And so I think that there's I just continue to believe there's opportunities to make it more convenient for customers, either through, other applications into which we embed, or the possibility of the alternatives as well.
You're working in partnerships, but not especially integrating other mobility services in the app, right?
Yes, and that's just the I just think that is the people ultimately want to go from point A to point B, and I think there's going to be a competition in the marketplace around, well, what apps allow you to go from point A to point B, and best facilitate that. I think there's lots of opportunity for experimentation.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for all your time, your questions. Emeric,
yeah, and now the specificity of the software is that we can jump on the right to networking.
Yeah,
it's like a chat roulette. It's like a chat roulette. You will have you can see all the people in the chat. We will have a 3 minutes meeting with each other. It's the goal of Mobility Makers is also to improve collaboration in the mobility industry. So, Joe, if you want to say a last word to the audience.
No, I'm just excited we had an opportunity to chat. Sorry we didn't get to more of the questions that were in the chat. And I hope that when we return to normal, I'm able to meet. There's several of you that I've already met that I saw in the chat room, but I would look forward to meeting you all the next time we're actually able to gather in one place.
Thank you so much.